time to go on the record with WRAL News.
Good evening and welcome to On the Record. I'm WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie. Tonight we're talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. DEI was one of the main themes of the national 2024 elections, and some Republican state lawmakers here have taken a cue from that and filed bills against it in North Carolina. One would ban schools from teaching, quote, divisive content. Another would make it a criminal offense, a misdemeanor, to use public money of any kind to promote any group above another, and open up local governments and even private individuals to lawsuits over it. That bill passed a key House committee this week, but critics say it could criminalize something even as innocuous as Black History Month. Well, here's more on that. State House Republican Majority Leader Brendan Jones claims DEI has eroded public trust in government.
For too long, DEI programs have replaced qualifications with quotas, achievement with identity, and excellence with activism. They do not expand opportunity, they create division.
The bill would make it a criminal offense to use public money to promote differential treatment or special benefits for any group. Democrats pointed out that such a broad definition could outlaw work on issues like racial health disparities or even honoring Black History Month. Jones doesn't see that as a problem.
And that we're trying to become one North Carolina, get away from this divisiveness that we keep talking about, that you keep talking about. That's what separates us. There's more that brings us together.
Representative Vernetta Alston represents Durham, a city with a strong DEI program.
I think employers and students and workers, folks across the state would agree that fairness and diversity are not at odds with each other. I think this bill suggests otherwise. I think the logic of it is misguided.
Representative Brandon Lofton said just 2 years ago, Republican lawmakers formed a committee to promote women in science. This bill would make that illegal.
But unfortunately, now we're bringing Washington politics into our state, and unfortunately, I don't think it's very well thought through. It's overly broad and vague, and anytime you add a criminal penalty to something, you need to be crystal clear about what it means. Otherwise, you're going to have a chilling effect, and that's going to get in the way of many, many efforts.
If the bill is more
Now, the state NAACP is against the bill. Their president, Deborah Maxwell, called it a direct attack on the principles of fairness and equal opportunity. As she added, banning DEI programs and restricting public funding from supporting them, is an attempt to erase the progress made in addressing systematic discrimination. Joining us tonight to discuss this bill is House Democratic Minority Leader Robert Reives, who spoke out against that bill this week. Also invited tonight, but was the sponsor of that bill, Representative Brendan Jones, who had agreed to appear on the program but canceled on us a few hours before taping. So we'll hear from him at his committee appearance a little bit in this discussion. Anyway, let's start with some basic context, right? The bill defines DEI as practices that are meant to influence hiring or employment practices with respect to race, sex, color, ethnicity, nationality, country of origin, sexual orientation, or other than through the use of merit-based hiring processes. Or B, which is promote differential treatment of or providing special benefits to individuals on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, nationality, country of origin, and sexual orientation. You get the idea. Yes. Here is what Jones had to say about the need for this bill in committee.
North Carolina. House Bill 171 isn't about politics. It's about ensuring that every individual is judged by their ability, not by race, not by gender or ideology.
Leader Reives, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I find it interesting because, and first, thanks for having me on here, Laura. It is, when you look at the history of what we call DEI, that goes back to 1865. That actually started at the end of the Civil War, in the recognition that we had a lot of people who had been injured, wounded during the war that needed to be able to get back on their feet. And so Congress recognized at that point, hey, we've got to do things to get them back on their feet. So when you take that back to today, and interestingly, this issue's come up probably 5 different times with disabled veterans, most recently with Barack Obama. So what is interesting is that what this bill does, as Representative Lofton was talking about, is just kind of vaguely throw some ideas out there to say, hey, you can't do these things, but then it doesn't tell you what not to do. And then it tells you where you can't differentiate groups and things like that. But again, it doesn't tell you what's bad and what's good. What I struggle with is when we start telling people how to create an environment that makes them the most productive. And when we start talking about things that don't help people with pathways to economic stability. And candidly, if you ask me, I mean, the whole push from the national level down to the state level is trying to answer a basic question. The basic question that a lot of people have right now is, why do I have to work 2 or 3 jobs in order to make it now? And so this would purport to say, well, the reason is because you haven't been able to get these jobs, but it doesn't address it at all.
Yeah, and we've asked that the sponsors of the bill, and also the sponsor of the bill in the Senate as well, this bill about schools, where are the examples, what are we seeing in state government that's prompting the need for this bill, right? Where are there local governments that are discriminating against people? I mean, quotas are already illegal, aren't they?
Exactly, and they've never been an issue, and that's what's amazing is that when you hear the discussion about the bill in Judiciary 2, there's talk about quotas and things of that sort. None of that has ever existed. And that's really what the problem is that it's a misdirection with people who are out here hurting. And so last night we had a chance to sign a bill to give money to Western North Carolina, which is the first money we've given to them. We're in March now. First money we've given to them this year. Yet we've been pushing bills about making sure that 18-year-olds can get guns. We're making sure that, DEI stops and all that kind of thing. And what we're doing is distracting people from the fact that our government's got one job, especially this year, to make sure that the federal tax money we've been paying gets back to North Carolina, and to make sure that we are getting people back on their feet, not just in Western North Carolina, but Eastern North Carolina, and folks that have moved here that are trying to get good jobs and help to fill the jobs in these industries. And that to me is all we've been doing, is just trying to keep people's eye for that ball, because 2 years from now, once they've killed DEI, what are they going to do? They're going to say, well, there's this other reason that we're not giving you jobs. And the thing is, we're not doing what we're supposed to do to help people prepare for the 21st century economy, and that's what we should be focused on.
What do you worry about in terms of implementation? I mean, when these bills are announced, even if they don't even become law, I mean, what's the effect that this has on people, like it's teachers in schools, let's say, or local governments trying to decide whether they're going to celebrate Pride Month or put banners up, for example?
Well, what you're alluding to is actually what the purpose of the bill seems to be. And that's to make sure that people don't have these discussions, that people don't promote these. And the worst part about it is what it does is the government tries to tell our folks in North Carolina, you should look at these groups differently. That if you see people from these groups in these areas, they don't deserve it, which is kind of a ridiculous response. Because when you think about it, I don't know of any private businesses that have said, you know what, I'm going to hire unqualified people. The people who get jobs are qualified. All this practice does, and again, originally done for soldiers, then it was done for women, and it's been done for different groups all through, is try to say, look, your natural tendency is going to do what we do at the General Assembly. I mean, you've come to General Assembly, it looks like a family reunion of donors and political appointees. And so what it's saying is, instead of going that route, which is more comfortable to you, I want you to broaden what you're looking at so that we've got the best minds and the smartest people doing what they're going to do. And that's really all these initiatives stand for.
What evidence is there that diversity is useful?
There are tons of evidence. And again, I always follow people who know what they're doing. So for instance, there's and I definitely wouldn't name the company or the industry, but there's a company that is based out of North Carolina that is one of the top 5 countries in the world. I mean, companies in the world as far as its ability to make money, its asset portfolio, things of that sort. What they recognize is this: we've got problems that we've got to be able to attack on a global scale. And we've got to figure out how to get the best minds, 1, to come to North Carolina, 2, to feel comfortable coming to North Carolina, and 3, to use their minds to help us push our product. And so when you have diversity, and diversity, again, this continues to push on race and gender. Diversity is what UNC Chapel Hill decided to embrace hundreds of years ago, 100 years ago. What they said is, we're not going to just get kids from Raleigh and Charlotte. Because if we just base it on your SATs and things like that, that's all we're going to do. We're going to make an effort to make sure that we're getting a geographical diversity so that we've got different ways to approach a problem. And that's all this does, is it tries to get people who are different from each other in some way to approach problems in different ways to come up with better solutions, which is really what we should be about. And that's why companies do it. This didn't become a hot button topic until 2020.
Right.
But before that point, companies were doing it because they were saying, for instance, look, women seem to be able to attack these problems a little bit better than men do for various reasons. People that come from the mountains seem to be able to understand these problems a little better than people from the Piedmont.
Sure.
And that's all it is. And so why would we want to limit the number of people that we're getting ideas from? Why would we want to expand that? But again, if your idea is to try to make people start thinking in terms of race and gender, then that's what this does, and it has that chilling effect.
Well, I think we'll probably be talking about this more as the session goes on, if you're right about that. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, House Minority Leader Robert Reives. We appreciate it. Coming back in just a few moments with our weekly Reporter Roundtable. Stay with us. Welcome back to On the Record. Time for our Reporter Roundtable. Joining us tonight are WRAL State Government Reporter Paul Spey and the Dean of the Capitol Press Corps AP reporter Gary Robertson. It has been some kind of week, hasn't it?
A lot of different things happening for a week, indeed. And a budget.
And a budget. But I mean, just to go back for a second, we were just discussing DEI. This is one of, I think we've seen several sort of national issues that have made an appearance, maybe more so than we've seen in sessions past. Do you think, what do you think is the impetus behind this?
I think it's sort of the draw of Trump. People see his popularity and they want to replicate it. And so we see down at the legislature, they're even implementing things like a mini Doge here in North Carolina, Doge short for Department of Government Efficiency, which is interesting considering that Republicans have controlled the legislature for over a decade now. It'll be interesting to see what they come up with. But my assumption is that that's the motivation there.
Yeah, I think it's a success factor that they've seen at national politics, Republicans winning on these types of issues. And I think there's also just the easier interconnection now between what happens here and in Washington. We were talking offline here about there's a place in the legislative building now where they have these kind of congressional style hearings where people come in and get sworn in and they're asked tough questions. Again, we saw tough questions, obviously, in sessions past, but it just seems to be more of an emphasis on maybe confrontation or showing that they're being tough on government.
Yeah, it's very sort of quasi-congressional. They get their time and they're recognized. And I've been there for 21 years now, and this is fairly new. It's fairly new. So other things, big things that happened this week, obviously, it's one of the big ones, is that we saw the first budget come out from our new Democratic governor, Josh Stein. Gary, were there any surprises in there for you?
Well, I think the fact that I would say that his predecessors seemed to want to have spent more, and I think Roy Cooper and he had what he thought were good reasons. Republicans generally disagreed, but I think with Governor Stein, he sees that the forecast shows that actually revenues are going to be going down, they think, in the second year of the biennium starting July 2026. And so I think there was some carefulness going on there. So there wasn't as much one thing in particular. Usually we hear from a governor about state employee raises for both years of the biennium, potentially. We only heard from one. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the revenues, but also what is going on with federal funds in Washington. And so I think there was just a little more caution in some of the initiatives that he put out.
And he only had a 2% raise in there for state employees, the State Employees Association calling that, insulting. Is that a mistake for a Democratic governor or any governor in North Carolina?
It could be politically, but one thing that jumped out to me was that Governor Stein seems to be trying to get along with Republicans more than former Governor Cooper did. And, we don't know what happened behind the scenes, behind closed doors when they negotiated, but I was struck in his State of the State address and in his budget rollout by just how warm he was. He came to the table saying in his budget, I don't want to raise taxes. I just am asking for a freeze, going back to the coming fiscal cliff that he says, the shortage we're going to have. And just his tone struck me. And he didn't include Helen funding in his state budget either, because he says he's working with legislators on that. And I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I would have thought that would have been what would have been in his budget for sure. But and it was an interesting choice to pull it out of it. I mean, I suppose it does keep the focus directly on the Helen funding and doesn't let it get lost in the larger picture of state spending. But I don't think you can argue that billions of dollars needed for storm damage does not somehow figure into the state's budget picture, right? Yeah. So I want to go back to the fiscal cliff. What is this fiscal cliff and how did we get here?
Well, some of it has to do that the legislature, the Republican-controlled legislature, has started a long process to reduce income tax rates. But I believe in the 23 budget had a twist where if the legislature met even higher revenue figures, then they would feel comfortable to actually reduce the rates even further, and that's automatic. And the reason why, according to forecasters, that we would see a potentially $800 million reduction overall in spending has to do with one of those triggers. And so there's, it'll be interesting to see if Republicans are concerned enough about this shortfall. We've heard for years from Republicans that they don't take the forecast all that seriously, or in the sense of they feel like that the private sector growth more than enough makes up for the lost revenue. So it seems like it'll be interesting to see whether they make any tweaks. We heard Destin Hall yesterday suggest that that's a possibility, but it all comes down to these triggers that we'll probably hear more and more about in the months ahead.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things that you pointed out yesterday, Paul, about those triggers is that those triggers were set some time ago, and that was before we had the kind of inflation that we were looking at now, right?
Right, and people may not realize that the personal income tax accounts for about 50% of the state's revenue. And years ago, they sort of set this schedule to make it go down each year. And so it's scheduled to go down about 1/4 of a percentage point each year if certain collection metrics are achieved, right? And so it's currently at 4.25%. It's scheduled to go down to 3.99%, and it could go down even more in the coming years. And that's where the gap emerges that we're talking about here. If personal income taxes account for about 50% of the state budget, and you're getting less and less, and you're not making up for it, something's got to give. And that's essentially what Stein was saying at his budget announcement earlier this week.
Right, and on the other side of things, on the spending side, I mean, everything costs more. I mean, it costs more for families, costs more for households, costs more for government. I mean, I think I've heard people say that the cost of road construction and like construction in general right now is like 20% higher than it was.
Yeah, I think I'll be interested to see whether Republicans go to the mantra of, well, maybe a more narrow focus on state government is the way to go here, which would mean actually reducing the monetary scope of government. We haven't heard that yet, but that's certainly one option as opposed to tweaking the tax rates.
At the same time, there's this appetite to cut, right? At the same time, we've seen, as you mentioned, the hearings. We've seen them, the Republican legislators, drag the head of the DMV in front of them in recent months, and sort of tear them apart and say, the services are bad, people can't get appointments, things like that. It'll be hard to cut services at public-facing agencies like the DMV, and then not improve services.
Oh, yeah.
That's what the commissioner said at the time. He said the reason we're not getting those services to people in a timely manner is because we don't have enough people. The state's grown by 2 million people. We haven't grown at all, right? So cutting maybe, well, I don't know. Maybe that's a good argument for privatization.
Potentially, and the population continues to grow. We should be the 7th largest state in the country in a couple years, and so that's not going to go away.
All right, well, we have to go to a real quick break. We hope you'll stay with us. A little bit more of this week's roundup when we come back. And welcome back to On the Record. Tonight we're doing the Reporter Roundtable with Gary Robertson and Paul Spey. The first budget of the session this week, hard to believe. Those are my words are coming out of my mouth because it's been, the first bill rather, because it's been 2 months. But the first bill of the session made its way to the governor's desk, was signed into law by Governor Stein on Wednesday evening. The Helen relief bill, right? We've been talking about this bill for like 10 weeks, I guess, now, 9 weeks. It was going to be the top priority, and it is the first thing they sent him, so I guess it qualifies, right? But there was a little bit of drama, a little bit of back and forth about that bill and what was in it and what wasn't in it. What ended up being the things that they were mostly fighting over?
Well, it was my understanding it was a lot to do with non-Helen stuff, particularly what to do about resolving the issues with housing from Florence and Matthew. I know that the House wanted to put it in a separate bill, the Senate wanted to put it all together, and so there was some discussion about that. There was also what to do about agricultural losses that were not Helen related. It was a bad year in 2024 with drought and heavy rainfall and another tropical storm, and it affected a lot of people. So they were trying to jigger that. I mean, I think everybody knew they were going to get across the finish line relatively quickly. But, there was certainly a little concern last week when it was the House that did not accept the Senate changes. Which was apparently a surprise to the Senate, because Senator Byrd said that the weekend before he'd been under the impression that it was going to go. So anyway, of course, Governor Stein talking about he wants that bill, needs the money right now. He even talked about it a little bit in the State of the State, and I think there was a little bit of rumor that he was hoping to be able to sign it at the State of the State address. What did he end up saying about that?
Well, I mentioned earlier that he's taken a different approach to working with Republicans than his predecessor. And it's funny, we learned the day before the State of the State that the House wouldn't be accepting the Senate's changes to this Helen bill, right? I got a text from someone on the Senate side saying, oh no, Stein's going to rake us across the coals in his State of the State. And he certainly could have. He could have gone up there the next night and said, the reason I don't have a bill today is because they couldn't, they were fighting amongst themselves over the details that Gary just mentioned.
We've heard some other Democrats say that. Yeah.
And he didn't do that. He said, we could use this bill, we're working together to get this done. And then when he did sign it, we saw Republicans, he invited Republicans to stand with him as he signed that bill just the other night.
It's an interesting change, a difference in personality, right? I never thought of Cooper as being, former Governor Cooper, as being particularly sort of, I don't know, pugilistic, I guess, but he did have an occasionally kind of spicy relationship with lawmakers in the last couple of years, especially. Governor Stein seems to be playing it much closer to the chest.
Well, I think it's also maybe the honeymoon period, too, that this is a 4-year, at least for him, 4 years, maybe more. And so he's got to work with these people a long time and a lot of different things. So he's probably going to keep his gunpowder dry, so to speak, in terms of what he what he really wants to emphasize and whether he needs to bring out his veto stamp on certain things. So I think it's a little too soon to tell, but certainly an interesting tone coming out of the first few months.
I was just going to add, I mean, he actually has a little bit of leverage, right? Because this is the year that the Republicans do not have a full veto-proof majority in both chambers. They're one shy in the House. So, the Speaker Dustin Hall argues, and he's probably right, that they have a working supermajority. They can probably swing a Democratic vote or at least convince somebody to walk. But at least you can say that the governor has the opportunity to do a little bit more behind the scenes than he has in a while and expect that to go somewhere. So maybe that's why he's not using the bully pulpit as much.
And I think there's going to be some certain issues that are more partisan leaning about elections, possibly about the topic you talked about earlier with DEI, where he'll be able to unify his Democratic allies. And maybe a veto will be sustained. But, on things like the budget, we've seen over time that it's been not easy, but Republicans have been able to pick off a few Democrats here and there based on, particular provisions in the budget.
Sure, absolutely. All right, well, hey, we're going to have to leave it there. But, gentlemen, thank you so much. Paul Spade, Gary Robertson with the AP, thank you for joining us. And thank you for joining us. If you have something to say about tonight's discussion, you can email us your comments, questions, or criticisms on the record at WRAL.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.